Today's Lunch and Learn, we're going to look at the book of the Bible called the Song of Songs. And I'm going to, oops, I have to be able to share here. There, oh, nuts. Can't share the screen. Should we start it over again? And okay, whoops, okay. There we go. And shoot. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about the Song of Songs, which here's a picture of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, taken from a children's storybook about their love relationship. Why is King Solomon on a cover of a book when I'm talking about the Song of Songs? Because the Song of Songs is traditionally supposed to have been written by King Solomon. So anyway, we're going to look at the Song of Songs and try to understand a little about the book, why it was written, what it says, and why we read it at this time of year. So where is the book, the Song of Songs? Here is an outline of the Hebrew Bible. We call it the Tanakh. We call it the Tanakh because of the letters T, N, and KH, Cha, right? And those three letters form the three parts of the Bible, the way Jews have divided up the books of the Bible. The first section of the Bible is called Torah with a T, and that includes the 5 books of Moses. The second section is called Nevi'im, that's the N. Nevi'im means prophets, but includes the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the early prophets, which I call the biggies, because they have big books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the later prophets, sometimes called the 12 minor prophets, because there's 12 of them, and they're minor because they have small books. Not because they're not important, they're all important, but they have little books. So sometimes also called the later prophets. So those are the first 2 sections, T, N, that corresponds to T, N here. And then KH is for Ketuvim, which means writings. The first 3 books and writings are the wisdom books, Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. And then comes the 5 Megillot, the 5 scrolls. The first of which is the one we're going to look at today, the Song of Songs, and then Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Each of these were called Megillot because long after we stopped producing them as scrolls, we started using the modern codex form of making a book, where everything is bound on one side and we can flip pages. These books were still read in the synagogue for liturgical purposes, and so we continued to read them from scrolls. And so they continue to be called the 5 Megillot. The most popular and famous one, of course, is Esther, which we still read from a scroll on Purim. The others we now read anyway from a book mostly. And each one of them is read on a holiday, as we'll see in a moment. Then comes in Ketuvim, the post-exilic books, when we return from the Babylonian exile, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And finally, what I call reruns, the books of Chronicles, which repeats the history of the books of the kings from the historical books above in the prophets. It's a retelling of those stories by a different author. Much of the same material, but told differently. So we're going to focus on the Song of Songs. Here are the 5 Megillot. Each one is read on a Jewish holiday, and the Song of Songs is read on Passover. I'll explain why a little later. The Book of Ruth is read on Shavuot, which we'll talk about next week. Lamentations is read on Tisha B'Av. Lamentations, as its name suggests, is a book of dirges, sad poems, really actually tragic poems of horrible death and destruction, which describes the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And it's read on the day of the year in the Jewish calendar, the 9th day of the month of Av. Tisha is 9th, Bet means in, and Av is the month. So Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, was the day the temple was destroyed. So on that day, when we are mourning the loss of the temple, we read the book that describes the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And then we read Ecclesiastes on Sukkot. That is the one I'll talk about 2 weeks from now. And finally, on Purim, of course, we read the book of Esther. So what is the Song of Songs? In my opinion, the Song of Songs is analogous to the Beatles. That's why I have these pictures here. It's a collection of love poems, love songs that were apparently very popular in ancient Israelite culture. And it was thought, you know, they first were collected and they became so important and so beloved that it was like, how can you leave them out of our canon of literature? It would be like leaving out the canon of Beatles songs from a collection of Western music. You just can't do it. So, I particularly picked these songs, She Loves You, Yeah, 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 8 Days a Week, and I Want to Hold Your Hand, because the early Beatles songs were really mostly about love and romance, and that's what the Song of Songs was. And the Song of Songs also was used a lot of poetry, imagery, double entendres, puns, plays on words, sound-alike sounds. I can't reproduce those for you. You would have to study them in the Hebrew language to catch all those little nuances. But you can see how the Beatles would do that also. When I was a kid, and I used to sing Beatles songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand, it seemed like a pretty innocent song to me. But as an adult, if you think about some of those lyrics, you'll say, there's something else going on here besides holding hands. In the same way, right, when you read this poetry in the book of Song of Songs, if you read it with a careful eye, you'll see that there's clever plays on words, and they're definitely implying and suggesting that there's some pretty serious erotic imagery going on over there. So you have to read it that way. That's probably how it was written. Who wrote this book? We don't know. But the most common popular modern Bible scholarly opinion is these little poems are little snippets of poems. They don't really form a storyline. They're snippets of poems. Again, remember, it's sort of like the favorite verses from the Beatles songs, let's say, that were collected together. Some of them have archaic Hebrew language in it. What does that mean? Well, for us, for me, for instance, if I went to a Shakespeare play, it takes me a while to acclimate my ears to understanding what the people are saying. Because even though it's English, it's Shakespearean English. And also they're speaking with a British accent. But it's hard to follow. It's hard for me to understand. And also Shakespeare used poetic language, flowery language. You kind of have to unpack it to figure out what the guy is really saying, even if the language was modern English. But it's just a little off, so it really throws you off to try and understand it. Well, the same thing is with Hebrew. Just like the English language developed over time, and by the way, Shakespeare's late Middle Ages, early Middle Ages was Chaucer. In one of my first classes in college, I took a class in English literature, and the professor got up and started reading Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the way it would have sounded to people in Chaucer's day. Completely unintelligible to any of us in the room. So, but yet it was English, right? But it was old enough, hundreds of years old, that it didn't really sound like anything we recognized. Same thing with biblical Hebrew, right? Hebrew developed over time as well, and modern Bible scholars, biblical Hebrew experts, can detect the sort of archaic forms of Hebrew words that reflect the fact that they're hundreds of years earlier than some of the other forms in the poetry in the book of Song of Songs. So again, the modern theory is that these were little snippets of poems actually written maybe over several centuries and then collected at a later point in time to create a whole book, not necessarily a storyline, but just to incorporate all these famous poems of love poetry that people wanted to hear. So who wrote it? We don't know. The tradition is that King Solomon wrote it. And the reason the tradition says King Solomon wrote it is because it opens with the words Shir Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, which means Song of Songs that are for or by Solomon. And who is the only Solomon we know about? King Solomon. So therefore, King Solomon must have written these poems. But that ascription, the title of the book, could simply have been a later addition to the book, which many scholars believe. And in any case, doesn't necessarily mean that Solomon wrote it. It could have been written on his behalf, or because people knew he was a great lover. He had many wives, according to the Bible. And so for whatever reason, it was ascribed to Solomon, but not really written by him. But the tradition says it was, written by him in his youth and when he was a lover of youth. And that he wrote 2 other books as well. The second book he wrote was the book of Proverbs, which is a book of wisdom, aphorisms, maxims to live your life by, Proverbs. The claim is that he wrote that book in his, as an older man, a mature man, because Solomon was known to be a wise king. And so he wrote down this book of wisdom. And then as an old man, he became somewhat of a cranky codger. And according to the tradition, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, which we'll look at in a couple of weeks. Ecclesiastes is a pretty depressing book about human life in many places. It seems to be pretty dismal way of looking at life and the value of life. So, so the suggestion is that King Solomon in his old age, when he's a little bit cranky, a little bit bitter, writes the book of Ecclesiastes. However, none of those books were written by him really. They were all written hundreds of years after King Solomon had died. So we don't know really who wrote it. The poems, they're individual poems that were collected together probably around the 3rd or 4th century before the Common Era, which means a little bit just before King Alexander the Great of Greece conquers the world, or maybe just a little bit after Alexander the Great conquers the world. Sometime in that time period, the Song of Songs were collected as a collection. How did this collection of love poetry get into the Bible? Well, one reason may simply be that it was very, as I said, very popular love poetry, and how could you exclude this popular love poetry? Besides, it probably maybe was used at wedding banquets, for instance. We still sing passages from the Song of Songs at wedding banquets today, right? Dodi li va'anilo haro bashoshanim, as I'll describe a little bit later, or Anila dodi v'dodi li, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. There are many passages in the Song of Songs, that some of them I'll give you examples, that became popular modern Israeli folk tunes and were often sung at wedding banquets, and we assume maybe they were sung at banquets from centuries before. So it was collected love poetry, either to use to romance, as part of the romantic, to try and get engaged with a person to get married, or when the marriage is finally formed and to celebrate the marriage. That's one reason. The more common reason given for how the book came into the Bible is that it was considered not to be racy love poetry. Rabbi Akiba famously in the Talmud says, I'm paraphrasing here, "Get your mind out of the gutters, gentlemen. This is not racy love poetry describing intimate body parts of the human being. This is actually a metaphor for the relationship between God and the people of Israel, and the passion and love that Israel should have for God and the passion and love that God has for Israel are being described metaphorically in this beautiful love poetry." Now, Rabbi Akiba didn't invent this idea. It actually already appears in the prophets. So for instance, the prophet Isaiah in chapter 54, verse 4-8, he says the following: "Do not be afraid, you shall not be shamed. Do not cringe, you shall not be disgraced. You will forget the derision of your youth. You will no longer remember the embarrassment of your widowhood. For he who made you will marry you. His name, Adonai Tzvaot, the Lord of hosts." So here in the book of Isaiah, again describing the relationship between God and Israel as this loving relationship. God is going to betroth and marry Israel, and it'll be this intimate, close, loving relationship. Jeremiah similarly, although he spends most of his book chastising the people for breaking their relationship with God, he opens his book, chapter 2, with these verses: "I have given you credit for the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness." A very romantic image of the bride following after her groom, traveling with him wherever he went throughout the wilderness. Of course, that's a bit of a romanticized memory about what actually happened. If you read the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll see that almost at every turn, the Israelites complained. "We don't have water, we don't have food, you brought us out here to die, Moses. Why did God take us out of Egypt? Let's go back home again. I want done with this relationship." The people are always complaining, but somehow Jeremiah is sort of romanticizing the history and saying, no, no, that was this beautiful romance where everybody was in love with each other. And I remember the romance of your youth, the devotion of your youth. But again, that's sort of the idea that the relationship between a man and a woman is depicted as God and the Israelites. And by the way, in the patriarchal world of the Bible, of course, a man could have more than one bride. A bride, of course, could only have one husband. So because of that, of course, the relationship, God is always the man who therefore commands absolute devotion of the bride, Israel. I like to point this out because in interfaith relations, that also leaves open the idea that God can have relationship with other people, but this is his special relationship with Israel. Not so Israel. Israel doesn't get to, cheat on God, though. So now, of course, that only works looking at it from a patriarchal perspective of days gone by, but nevertheless, that's when the Bible was written. Okay, and then finally, I want to point out Hosea, the last example I'm going to give you today of a prophet who talks about this loving relationship. The whole book of Hosea is about the relationship, most of it disparaging again about unfaithfulness between a wife and a husband. But in one chapter, couple verses of Hosea, there's this beautiful passage which we recite every time we put on our tefillin. So we put on those leather boxes that talk about how much we should love God, and we fasten it on our arms, right? The V'ahavta et Elohecha, you should love the Lord your God, is written on the box that we fasten to our arms. We wrap the strap around our arms, and then as we're wrapping the strap around our middle finger, our ring finger, so to speak, it's not really our ring finger, but it's as if we're putting on a wedding ring, we say these words from the book of Hosea. Ve'erastichli leolam, I will betroth you forever. I will betroth you with righteousness and justice, and with goodness and mercy. I will betroth you with faithfulness, and then you will be devoted to the Lord. So this loving relationship that we're supposed to have with God, we remember every morning when we put on our tefillin and we quote these words from the book of Hosea. So first the prophets and then later the rabbis were wise enough to use this very popular metaphor and genre of literature about romance between a man and a woman to teach moral lessons. And we could do the same thing, by the way, with Beatles songs in reverse, right? So she loves you, yeah, 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 right? Could actually be he loves you, yeah, 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 talking about how much God loves you, right? Now, of course, you notice what I did. I assumed God was a he. Today, we don't make that assumption. God doesn't have a gender. So you could still say, she loves you, yeah, 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 and think about God as a loving mother, right? So also possible. Or how about help, I need somebody, help, not just anybody, help, I really need someone. Who do I need? I need God, right? So again, the song could be used as a metaphor for your relationship with God. And or if you're having difficulties with God, you could sing, we can work it out, right? So again, we could play these games with a lot of the Beatles songs. The metaphor still works today. So that's why we read the book of the Song of Songs on Passover. That is to say that on Passover was considered by the rabbis to be the moment of betrothal of the Israelites to God. God took us out of Egypt, right? So it's like taking the bride away from her family home, right? And betroths the bride to God's self, right? So betroths Israel to God. So this was the betrothal. And at the betrothal, you sing love poetry, you sing the Song of Songs, which is metaphorical for that loving relationship between God and Israel. That's why we read it on Passover. And by the way, following that metaphor, when is the wedding? The wedding is on Shavuot, when we receive the 10 Commandments, because in Jewish tradition, a wedding is consummated with a written wedding contract called a ketubah. And the wedding contract, in our case, is the 10 Commandments. So God gives us a ketubah, just like the husband gives the wife her ketubah. God gave us a ketubah of the 10 Commandments, and that makes the marriage finalized. So the romance is in Passover. We read love poetry, and then we get to the marriage ceremony, and we get the ketubah, the 10 Commandments. Another reason, of course, for reading the Song of Songs at Passover is biological. It's springtime, right? So just like everybody around the world celebrates springtime, the rebirth of the trees with bunny rabbits and eggs, which are both fertility symbols. By the way, that's why they became associated with Easter, not because it has anything to do with Christianity, but because, you know, we're thinking about new life, rebirth, etc. at springtime, and what a great time to talk about love and romance, and therefore sing the Song of Songs. Some communities, particularly in Sephardic communities, have the tradition of reading the Song of Songs every Friday night before the Friday night evening service. Why? Because Shabbat also represents this special relationship between God and the Israelites, right? That loving relationship that we're supposed to have on the Sabbath. And so to introduce the Sabbath into our world, we sing Song of Songs to remind us of that relationship. So let me read some of the famous passages that come out of the Song of Songs. You're welcome to read the book. If you do, try and read it with a commentary that kind of picks up on the little double entendres and the hints at sexuality, so that you won't miss some of it. Although if those of you who are not poetry challenged like me, you may be able to figure it out for yourself. In any case, there's a song that we sing, though made famous by the Weavers. For those of you who are my generation or older, may remember the Weavers. Pete Seeger was one of the singers in that group of folk singers. And they sang a song called Kisses Sweeter Than Wine. Well, where did they get that expression, kisses sweeter than wine? It comes from the opening verse of the Song of Songs. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more beautiful than wine, is more delightful than wine, right? Your love is more delightful than wine. Kisses are sweeter than wine. So that's where that song came from. Another one is She Says, but so a lot of these poems are he says, she says. So she says to her lover, I am like a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. And he says back to her, like a lily among thorns, so is my darling among the maidens. Keshoshana ben hachochim ken rayati ben abanot. You are like a lily among thorns. What is he saying? You stand out amongst all the other maidens. You alone, you are beautiful and perfect and fragrant and beautiful and delightful. The others are like thorns. You get pricked on it. It's like, I don't want to deal with them. You're very special. So you are like a lily among the thorns. And he is responding to her saying, I am like a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. The next one, that's from Song of Songs, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And then chapter 2, verses 10 through 12. Arise, my darling, my fair one, and come away. For now the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The blossoms have appeared on the earth. The time of singing has come. And the song of the turtle dove is heard in the land. Right? This is perfect love poetry to sing at springtime. That's exactly what it's describing. Now, here I'm going to give you one example of the double entendres. I didn't make this up. Don't blame me. I got this when we had a Bible scholar here from Hebrew University. He was our Horvitz scholar in residence several years ago. His name is Yair Zakovich, and he did a class on the Song of Songs. So this is a verse and how he interpreted it. Catch us the foxes. This is chapter 2, verse 15. Catch us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vineyards, for our vineyards are in bloom. So it probably doesn't take too much imagination to figure out who the vineyards are or what the vineyards are here, the vineyards that are in bloom, that may be spoiled by the foxes, etc. Anyway, so there's two ways to interpret this passage. One is take the foxes away so they won't spoil the vineyards. Catch the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vineyards. Catch them so they won't spoil the vineyards. Or perhaps the women are calling out, come foxes and catch us and spoil the vineyards. In any case, I didn't make that up. That's from a Bible scholar from Hebrew University, Yair Zakovich. And in a similar way, if you read many of the passages in the Song of Songs and you read it with a certain eye towards these things, you can catch the double meanings. Very famous one in the Song of Songs comes from chapter 2, verse 16, the very next verse. My beloved is mine and I am his, who browses among the lilies. In Hebrew, Dodi li va'ani lo haroeh b'shoshanim. This became a very popular Israeli folk dance and folk song. Again, could have been sung at weddings or danced at weddings. When I was in my youth, I used to be in an Israeli dance troupe, and I did this dance. I learned all of the old Israeli folk dances. One of the oldies. Dodi li va'ani lo haroeh b'shoshanim. My beloved is mine, and I am his, who browses among the lilies. Now that may have sounded a little bit familiar to you, but not quite, because it's actually echoed a few chapters later. Chapter 6, verse 3, it says kind of the opposite. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Ani ledodi, ledodi li. I am for my beloved, and my beloved is for me. That's the opposite of my beloved is mine, and I am his, right? Kind of reversed it. So not surprising that many of these little folk phrases there were permutations of them that were developed. And unfortunately, we don't have music. I assume that this was not just poetry read, but actually was also set to music. Unfortunately, nobody knew how to notate music 3,000 years ago or even 2,500 years ago. And so we have no idea how these songs may have sounded. But since I'm married to a cantor, I think about it anyway, and wish we could have had somebody tape record it so we'd know what it sounded like when they sang them. And then there's a phrase that Diane and I put on our wedding invitation, one that I thought was especially nice, a very poetic formula, and it's Matzati et she'ahava nafshi. I have found the one my soul desires. Matzati et she'ahava nafshi. I found the one my soul desires. So we put that on our wedding invitation. Now here's another one that has some sort of graphic descriptions of parts of the body. It's chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Ah, you are fair, my darling. Ah, you are fair. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. I guess doves are kind of pretty and cute looking, so your eyes are like doves. That's good. Your hair is like a flock of goats streaming down Mount Gilead. That doesn't sound very romantic to us, but I think the idea is that she has a lot of curls back there, and the curls are like goats, you know, sort of leaping down the mountain, sort of. Anyway, he saw it as romantic. It doesn't sound so romantic to me, but it must have lost something in translation. In any case, he goes on, your teeth are like a flock of ewes climbing up from the washing pool. Okay, so sheep who come out of washing, right? So their hair is now snow white, right? So your teeth are white. Remember, this is in the days before toothbrushes and toothpaste. So to have white teeth was a big deal, and it was very attractive. So not that her teeth looked like sheep, but the idea was they were color white. They were very bright and shiny white, like sheep coming out of the washing pool. And all of them bear twins. Not one of them loses her young, right? Which means she hasn't lost any of her teeth, right? She has a full set of teeth. Again, before dentists, people got cavities, teeth fell out, whatever. You're not as attractive. This woman has all her teeth still, and they're white and shiny. So that was a big deal. And then he goes on, your lips are like a crimson thread, right? Obviously red lips. Your mouth is lovely. Your brow behind your veil is like a pomegranate split open. I don't know, not too romantic for me, but again, I guess it was a sort of a reddish color that this gentleman liked. He thought it was very attractive. And then finally, your neck is like the Tower of David. Who wants to think of their neck like a Tower of David? Built to hold weapons, hung with 1,000 shields, all the quivers of warriors. What the heck is that? Well, that means she has a very long neck and she's wearing a very fancy necklace, right? And it's probably silver, and the silver is like plated with shields, right? So it looks, he's kind of analogizing it to the shields of armor, but it's beautiful jewelry that she's wearing, and that's what he is impressed by. Okay, so, and the last one that I will quote for the day is from chapter 5, verse 2. I was asleep, but my heart was aroused. Hark, the voice of my lover, he knocks. Open for me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. The voice of my lover knocks. Kol dodi dofek is how you say that in Hebrew. Kol dodi dofek, the voice of my lover knocks. That became famous in the 20th century when Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik wrote a book about the birth of the state of Israel, and he titled it Kol Dodi Dofek, right? Because the rebirth of the state of Israel, he saw as a sign, right, that God is knocking at the door for us, right? He wants us to rejoin in a relationship now that we are resettled in our homeland and we've rebuilt it into a new Jewish state. So his book was called Kol Dodi Dofek, and he took that title from the Song of Songs. So all of these are famous passages from the book, The Song of Songs. It's kind of a fun, short book to read. Again, I would recommend, if you're like me, poetry challenged, you read it with the commentary so that it can pick apart some of the metaphors, the double entendres, the puns, give you some taste and flavor of what the poetry was all about. And it's a nice book to read at springtime, even though we're all locked in our houses right now. Nevertheless, we can look out our windows and see springtime, and every now and then go out for a walk and enjoy. I just saw jasmine blossoms out in our neighborhood. One of my favorite scents is jasmine. So it's that time of year to read the Song of Songs and enjoy the love poetry of springtime. So with that, I wish you a good day. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the responses on Facebook. And next week, we'll look at the book of Ruth, which we're going to read for the holiday of Shavuot. Thank you.